Hey friends, welcome to Embracing Your Season. I'm your host, Paige Klingenfield. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm at the AACC National Conference in Dallas, Texas, and I have an exciting interview for you today. Joining me on the show is Zach Clinton. Zach is an author, speaker, podcast host, vice president of the American Association of Christian Counselors, and president and host of the Ignite Men's Impact Weekend that gathers nearly 10,000 men each year. A former Division I college baseball player and now the chaplain of the Liberty University baseball team. He is a recognized growing authority and voice on performance and mental health for today's generations, dedicating his life to reminding people that they are never out of the fight. Now, of course, if you would like to find more information about Zach, you can check his website out at zachclinton.com. That's spelled Z-A-C-H Clinton.com. Now, make sure you stay tuned to the end of the show for some of my takeaways with my conversation with Zach. Let's get started now with Zach Clinton on this edition of Embracing Your Season. Well, Zach, thanks so much for joining me today on Embracing Your Season. I love that we get to have this conversation.
Yes, Paige. Thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing.
Thank you. So tell us more about yourself, where you're at today, and a little bit about your future, because we're talking about you're getting ready to get your PhD, and I love the direction that's going.
Yes. No, I have the wonderful opportunity of serving as the vice president here of the American Association of Christian Counselors. I work alongside of my dad, which is one of my, honestly, truest honors and one of my highlights in life. Just getting to learn from him, glean from his wealth of wisdom and knowledge in this Christian counseling space. I really view him as a pioneering leader and really a coach and a mentor and a best friend, so much more than just a dad. My wife and I came up on 3 years of marriage as of September the 5th, so we're having a lot of fun. Thank you very much. And like you mentioned, we're both in our doctoral programs. I'm in mine in counselor education and supervision, a PhD, and she's in a DNP, a doctorate of nurse practitioning, so she wants to be a family nurse practitioner. So we both are in a very busy season of life, Paige, but it's been fun to navigate together. That way we're not doing separate paths or trajectories in our journeys, but we're very similar. And so it's been a lot of fun just to be able to do that alongside of her. Her name is Evelyn. So love Evelyn to pieces, and it's been a blast.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, gosh, I loved, tell us a little bit more about your dissertation, because we talked offline a little bit about that. Yes. I would love for people to hear more about your direction.
So I have a heart for sports. I grew up playing 3 sports my entire life: football, basketball, and baseball. Had the opportunity of going on and playing college baseball at Liberty University for 4 years. And then I got into this really sports psychology, sports counseling space. And so a lot of my work clinically is not just with the next generation, youth, adolescents, young adults, but specifically I love working with athletes. So I get the opportunity of being the athletic counselor at Liberty University now. I work with a lot of the athletes on a daily basis. And one thing that really interests me is what are the components that either impact or sustain human flourishing among NCAA Division I athletes over time. And so my dissertation specifically is a repeated measures test. I gave them a lot of data, a lot of measurements before the semester. I'll do the same thing post-semester, but a lot of those measurements dealt with attachment. So parental attachment, God attachment, and specifically player-coach attachment, and how those things impacted their level of flourishing in spite of their performance on a field or on a court. And so a lot of these components, you start to recognize that flourishing, that thriving, that prosperity, these are internal traits. Peace, internal, not external. And it really is kind of anchored in scripture. I think of James chapter 1, verses 2-4 that talk about considering it pure joy when we face trials of many kinds, for we know that the testing of our faith goes on to produce perseverance. So let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature, complete, and lacking nothing. So it's this whole aspect that, we can consider it joy not because of the pain or the trial or the suffering, but because of what it could produce in and through us if we allow God to let it. So that's where my heart lies, especially in sports, is giving people a proper perspective.
Wow, you are just preaching it. I love that. I would love to know a little bit more about flourishing. So we know that word. We all have our ideas of what it means, but what's the definition that you would use, especially in your research?
Flourishing at the end of the day, there, again, no real concrete definition, but it comes back to this component that it's being able to perform or live at an optimal rate. And it's very holistic. A lot of people would say, that's physically, or that's, mentally, that's emotionally. No, it also includes things like the relational components of life and the spiritual components of life. I'm doing a lot of my research around Tyler Vanderwill. He has a flourishing index, and he has kind of 6 domains. He talks about happiness and life satisfaction, satisfaction, character and virtue, purpose and meaning. He talks about close social relationships. He talks about financial and material stability and well-being. He talks about all of these different components. And then he also mentions physical and mental health. And so when you tie all of those things in, you're really trying to help somebody say, all of these components or all of these domains in my life, I would recognize as being good. And when they can recognize in a holistic sense that life is going well, or they would define it as good, that's when a lot of the research would say you're actually experiencing this flourishing state.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to get in this flourishing state.
I know, right?
Fantastic.
I know
right?
it. It is
It's
indeed.
the direction of, and I love the combination of the relationship, the spiritual. I mean, it really is holistic. But how often are you seeing that people just drift naturally into that? I mean, this is something we have to do intentionally, right? So what are some recommendations to get into that flourishing mindset?
Very much so. Well, as a Christian, and from that Christian worldview, I think it all comes back to recognizing that, our power and our peace can only be found through surrender. This idea of flourishing, it's actually very biblical. In the Old Testament, it was just being able to be recognized as shalom. It's a word that talked about ultimate peace and satisfaction in life. And then in the New Testament, it's talking about blessedness, or in John 10:10, the abundant life, right? We can recognize it through all of these different components, but I think it comes down to, at the root and at the core, is feeling seen and feeling loved and feeling heard and understood by a God who created us that is outside the dimensions of time, matter, and space. And so when we recognize that we were created for a purpose, right, by a purpose, then there is something beautiful in being able to feel secure and really flourish in every component and facet of our lives. But the more we deviate or stray away from those things, I think the more susceptible we are to having a lot of damage and a lot of wounds in our lives as well.
Yes, the whole feeling seen and loved. I imagine that probably correlates with the attachment that you were referring to earlier. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so when you talk about attachment, I love Dr. Dan Siegel's work. My dad, I'll say this, I'll give my dad a shout out, Dr. Tim Clinton. He has so many books on the concept of attachment, especially from a biblical standpoint. And he talks about attachment styles, there being secure, the ambivalent, the avoidant, and the disorganized. But Dr. Dan Siegel simplifies it really, really well in a book titled The Power of Showing Up. And in that book, he talks about 4 S's. The first one, he talks about safety. When we can make our kids feel safe, like we are their safe haven, it gives them the opportunity to, in a sense, go out with independence and confidence, to fail, to make mistakes, and then to come back to us to recognize that we will be that safe haven, not just that will surround them, but that will support and sharpen them in life. Then he talks about seeing our kids. And what he means by that is seeing them emotionally. We always sometimes see the negatives in people. We see their behavior, but he's talking about what's going on up here beneath the behavior, right? Seeing them emotionally. The third one is soothing our children. Talks about not promising a life of ease or a life of comfort, that life is just going to be, simple for them, but it's being able to really educate and equip our kids with coping skills that when the inevitable tough times come in life, that they have to recognize. And I love how he says this: a soothed child never has to suffer alone. And then when we provide them by showing up with the safety, seeing them emotionally, and then being able to soothe them in times of need, he says that then our kids are able to rely on a secure attachment again. And so I love those 4 S's.
Yeah, that's great. Let's go back to the safety about making mistakes. We were kind of talking about this offline as well. As my kids, I have 4, they're all in the school system right now, and everything is performance based.
Oh, yeah.
They're comparing themselves to their peers. They're thinking about how this influences their future, and grades really does dictate sometimes identity, which I'm not a fan of. Can we totally flip the script on that and change the world, change the culture in that way? I wish we could. And then you add in the sports element. So if they're not doing well in school and then they're struggling on their sports teams, like how do we create that safe haven within our own home to help them know that mistakes are okay while still asking them to do their best work at school or in the sports?
Jonathan Haidt has a new book out. It's a bestseller called The Anxious Generation.
Yes.
And he talks about, right, the digitally connected generation that those that were born after 1996 are. And he really just mentions how we're the most digitally connected, but the most relationally disconnected generation out there. And you talk about comparison in social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, all of these different social media platforms that really are pulling our kids in all these different directions. And we recognize this, that comparison is the thief of joy. But when we live, in a sense, a comparison culture built on perceived perfection, where we can post our human highlight reel, but never actually are vulnerable about the inevitable suffering that we all go through in life, it makes us feel like, man, maybe we're alone in this fight. And so, as you're mentioning, when it comes to identity, it's being able to have a proper perspective and an accurate understanding of really who we are in this life. And when you throw in sports and different things like that, you see why kids struggle, right? Kids being raised during this day and age, I mean, they're up against it. It's a tough time to raise kids or to be a kid. And so I always try to remind kids, when it comes to identity, when it comes to worth, when it comes to value, those things are detached from their performance. I love, when we're talking about working with athletes, it's so easy when you have a bad game or you have a bad outing or you have a bad performance, whatever it looks like in life. It's really easy to begin to, in a sense, shame yourself. And the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is when we feel, in a sense, convicted because of the behavior. Shame says, I am the failure, right? It places the emphasis on the self. And so when whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a coach or a counselor, maybe listening to this conversation today, it's being able to confirm a child's identity so that the world doesn't have to conform it. And being able to really remind them that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, being able to remind them of, again, that they are loved, that they are seen, that they are valued, that they are cherished. But when a kid doesn't feel that or doesn't sense that, again, they are left very susceptible to experiencing a lot of challenge and a lot of adversity in this life because they feel like they have to go about it alone.
So at what point do the parents speaking into their kids about their identity, because we do it all the time, we tell them you're fully loved, we love you just the way that you are, where that no longer measures to the degree that peers are speaking into them, where it kind of goes down a little bit in their identity because the peers are speaking negative.
Absolutely.
Even as we believe as Christians, they're speaking death over our kids. So at what point do parents have to intervene and help our kids recognize that the peers aren't speaking truth, we're speaking truth, and they find their truth on their own? How do they navigate all of those things?
I think first and foremost, it's the time that is necessary to have those types of conversations. We live in such a preoccupied society that a lot of parents don't ever take the time to actually slow down to have those meaningful conversations in the first place, right? The statistics around like the dinner table are fascinating. My dad always says, we always hear the statement that those who pray together stay together. But my dad also says those who pray together, who play together, and who eat together stay together, right? That's, in a sense, the idea of family. And I'm so grateful that my parents, they prioritized all three of those. We prayed together all the time. We played, whether it was throwing a ball, whether it was wrestling as a little kid, it didn't matter. Like, I knew that my parents were going to show up, and then we ate together. And I think that idea of secure attachment helped me to find security in myself. And then I was able more effectively to look for the friends, to look for my peers who had that, whether it was the same kind of security in themselves as well, or I was able to recognize because of what I was receiving at home that, you know what, I wasn't going to be swayed, or I really wasn't going to be, in a sense, conformed to the way or the patterns of friendships or peers at school. I knew who I was because my parents continually reminded me of that, and their words aligned with their actions. A lot of parents, they can say it, they can talk until they're blue in the face, but it's like, do you really show and display that type of love for your child? Do you model vulnerability every single day? Are you showing up to the point where your kid feels so confident in that love that no other form of love could sway them away?
That's so good. Speaking to the parents, and I kind of fall into this as well, is, again, we're busy. We have so many things. So eating on a regular basis with our kids as a whole family, like
hard.
We get to have play dates, carpool, McDonald's on the way to soccer practice kind of thing. But like for those that it's not a season where they're making a priority out of eating together, what are some other ways that we can continue to make sure we're speaking truth and love over our kids?
It's such a great question because, like you said, I get it. Busyness is, running rampant all over society. And there's a lot of people who maybe don't even have the time. They have the pressure to perform, right? The pressure to provide, the pressure to protect. There's a lot of pressures that are facing parents today. And what I always just try to remind them is I'm not putting pressure on you by saying these things. I'm just trying to remind you of how significant your presence is in your child's life. And so it's not as much about, like you said, you have to eat together. You have to have these rigid routines as much much as it is finding maybe daily or weekly rhythms that can help you just connect. I have a dear friend of mine named Pastor Ted Cunningham who did a lot of mentoring of myself, especially going into my marriage. And a lot of times I try to equip parents with the same way he tried to equip me with my wife, Evelyn. He said, take a daily delay, a weekly withdrawal, and an annual abandon. And so this daily delay is like 10, 15, 20 minutes a day. And we would call it special time in our counseling space, where it's 20 minutes, 10, 15, whatever you want to do, whatever you have time for, but prioritizing that time every day to do something in your child's world, not to do something that you want to do as a parent. You're not controlling the outcome. You're not telling them what you're going to do, but really saying, hey, what's something that you would like to do? Being intentional about that. Doesn't have to be an hour, right? I'm not asking you to throw away your whole day in your mind, but it's such intentional time that means so much to your child. So some special time, daily delay. A weekly withdrawal in a marriage or in a relationship, that would mean, for instance, like a date night, doing something out of the ordinary. So maybe once a week, you do something fun with your kids. You take them somewhere cool. You go to the movies. You go on a play date outside, whatever it looks like. You do something out of your normal routine. And then an annual abandon, he would recognize as an opportunity to go explore, to take an adventure together, not just in a marriage, but with your family. Maybe it's a vacation, maybe it's a staycation. You do something at home, something different, something unique, but you never stop exploring and learning from one another.
And I love that you're mentioning marriage as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how important it is to connect with your spouse as it correlates to your family health as well?
I tell you what, sometimes our spouses are the ones that we will overlook the most because we feel like, hey, well, they're always going to be there, right? So like you come home and you're there physically, but you're not there emotionally, or you're not there mentally. And that connection hasn't quite been felt. And so that's something I can be vulnerable here and say early on in Evelyn and I's marriage, within that first year, probably something that I had to learn personally was I have this empathetic spirit about me where I always want to help people. And so I sometimes struggled with the boundaries of saying no, especially when it was like, man, I don't want to neglect my Jerusalem to help the Judea, Samarias, and othermost parts of the earth. I want to make sure that I'm prioritizing my wife and my family and my own personal home. And so I had to learn, right, boundaries. I had to learn what that looked like, not overworking, not over helping, but recognizing that my family, my wife is my greatest ministry. And if we don't recognize that, it can quickly become your greatest misery. And so I truly believe that being able to invest in the life of one another, spending quality, intentional time, again, never stop learning about one another, have intentional, meaningful conversation. And the greatest form of empathy is inquiry. Don't be afraid to ask questions and make less assumptions in marriage, especially. I think that is a sure way to foster deeper connection moving forward.
I love that. It's like remaining curious about your partner.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
My husband and I, we've been married 18 years, and we can overlook probably some things that think we know our partner. But what's so cool is every day is a new day. We get a new experience, and it is the first time raising kids at the age that they are now. And we talked about, I have 4 kids, 3 of which are teenagers, one's a preteen. Like, our house can be a hot mess sometimes, it can be crazy. And so my husband and I, we have to be so intentional about making sure we're not roommates, because it can become such an interaction of rhythm if we're not intentional with that. And so I know for us, as well as we're trying to grow in our parenting, we're trying to go as a marriage couple, we're also trying to build community. Speak a little bit about making sure that you're mindful of the community that you're surrounding your family with and how important that is.
I think it is everything first and foremost, but I'm reminded of a book by a guy named Justin Whitmel Early, and his book is called Made for People. And in this book, it's very fascinating. He talks about how we kind of fall prey to this current of loneliness. And my wife being in the medical field, I'm reminded that if loneliness is the invisible illness of our day and age, she always says this, that it's the undiagnosed diseases or illnesses that are always the most dangerous and deadly. And so Justin has such a unique way of defining loneliness as well. When we think of loneliness, we'd probably consider or have the thought of somebody who locks himself at home, is like one of those hermits that doesn't come out much. Right. But he talks about that loneliness in his definition is someone who used to have friends. And I thought, man, that hit me to my core, right? Before the promotion, before the new job, before the big move, before you got married, before you had kids, right? Finding friends was once really easy because they were always around you, whether it was at school or college. But then when you grow up and you get that big boy, big girl job,
Yeah, what
it can
happened?
easily slide through the cracks, right? But like
Sure.
you said, it's being able to be intentional about the people we surround ourselves with. Scripture always mentions this. Proverbs 27:17 is very iconic, right? As iron sharpens iron, so one man should sharpen another, right? Finding people that won't just surround you, but that will support you and sharpen you. And not just seeking a community for validation and
Oh,
affirmation,
that's good. Yeah.
but also for teaching and correction, because those things matter so much. And we want people that will kind of call us up in this life, not demean us, but demand more from us because they believe in us. And I'll close out this little piece here for a second with a story. There's a guy named Sidney Poitier who has a book, The Measure of a Man. And he gives this beautiful imagery. He says, it's amazing what happens when you go on a walk or a jog on a run with someone. Either you adjust to their pace or they'll adjust to yours. And then he prompts the question, whose pace have you adjusted to? And that always, every time I read that, every time I think of that,
Yeah, that's good.
I think of my community and I'm like, whose pace have I adjusted to?
That's such a good challenge. And it's just the reminder of being just present in the moment, taking an assessment, figuring out where do I need to improve and grow, what my values are.
Yeah.
And hopefully, in many people, it's the family, it's the marriage. That is the cornerstone of what we do.
Yes.
And of course, our relationship with Jesus. So as we conclude, I would love to hear, what is one encouragement you can give to parents out there that are listening right now?
One encouragement that I would give to parents, it really kind of stems from a message that God has placed on my heart as of recent. I have a book titled Even If, and it comes out of Daniel chapter 3. And really it's for like the weary, the discouraged, the disappointed individual. And it's that account in scripture, one of my favorites. When I've gone through some of the deepest, darkest, most difficult seasons of my own personal life, I always think on this, where back in the day, you think of way back in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He has this decree. He builds this altar, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, this massive golden image or statue. And then on the sound of music, he asks everybody in the entire empire to bow down and worship. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to bow the knee, refuse to conform to culture or their circumstances, but say, I'm only going to conform to the image of Christ. So they choose to stand. And there's this encounter where Nebuchadnezzar calls them in, and he's frustrated and he's angry and he's embarrassed. And he says, is it true that when I play the sound of music, that you guys are choosing to, in a sense, be willingly disobedient to my decree? Now I'll give you one more chance. If you choose to bow down and worship, very well. But if you don't, there's a burning hot fiery furnace, in a sense, awaiting a permanent death sentence for you. And they respond in a way in which so many of us that are discouraged probably wouldn't. They say, you know what, King, you don't even have the right to approach us about this matter. In other words, we thought about it. We've already made up our mind. Not only do we believe that our God is able, but we have the confidence, the assurance. We believe that our God will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But then they say two transformative words that always ring true in my life. But even if he does not, we will not bow down and worship this image of gold you set up before us, or your gods. And ultimately, it just reminds us, and this is what I would leave with parents, there's a difference between what if, only if, and even if. A lot of parents live lives, I would say, paralyzed by fear. We would call it analysis paralysis, so afraid of what could happen tomorrow that it leaves them, in a sense, crippled or idle in the present moment of today. What if leads to, in a sense, a complacent faith, a complacent life. We don't like complacency. But then there's that only if aspect where it's like, I'll do it only if it works out in my favor, only if this works out for my kid, only if it's comfortable and convenient, but only if then leads to a contingent faith or a contingent life. We don't want complacent, definitely don't want contingent. But then that last one I'll offer you is even if it's hard, even if it hurts, even if it's the road less traveled, even if nobody else is doing it. And I always say, even if you don't get out of life what you were hoping, expecting, praying, or preparing to get out of it, we're going to make that choice to stay true to our faith, to stay true to our family, to stay true to our friends, and to stay true to the standard within us, rather than succumbing to the expectations, opinions, or circumstances around us. And I believe then the three lessons that story always reveals to me, to a discouraged parent, to a weary parent out there, I would say that sometimes following Jesus leads you straight into the fire. Number two is God equips us and gives us friends for the fire. And the third is that sometimes the clearest view of God that you'll ever find can only be found in the fire. That's what I love about his story. God was in the fire from the beginning, and he never left. So, my friend, if you're in that challenging season, you feel like you have a wayward child, a discouraged marriage, whatever it looks like, just remind yourself that hope is a person and hope has a name, and that name is Jesus.
Amen. I love that. It does feel like we are in a season, we are all in a fire. Dang. I would love for people to find your book and your resources. Where can they find all that information?
I appreciate that question, Paige. They can just simply go to zachclinton.com. That has not only the book, but a podcast, some other free resources that people can find. Hopefully, that can just help you enhance not just your mental health, but your spiritual growth and discipleship as well.
Well, thank you so much again for this conversation. This has been so fun as well as enlightening. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Paige. You are an incredible interviewer and great at what you do. I appreciate this time.
Oh, thanks. Friends, I had such a blast having a conversation with Zach. I absolutely believe you guys will be hearing more from him on all his research, performance-based, as well as his heart for Jesus. Now, today our conversation was pretty amazing because he started with flourishing. Now, that's a word that I have heard pretty frequently within the counseling realm. So I asked him to dig a little bit deeper in what flourishing meant. And he was able to define that for us in such a way that it was multifaceted. So you're able to find flourishing in your physical health, in your mental health, spiritual and relational health. And I love that because we get to take these principles and we get to teach our kids how to have healthy, holistic lifestyles and to ultimately flourish. So, how do we help our kids get this? That's some of the takeaways that I have today. The first one is reminding our children their worth is not dependent on their performance. All right, I'm going to say it again. Their worth is not dependent on their performance. So in their season of life right now, they're in school, they're in sports, and even for the teenagers out there, they have Snapchat streaks that rank your best friends. That's right. These are things that I learn all the time from my teens. It changes all the time, but when we have conversation, we're able to see that they are actually surrounded by performance determined identity situations. We need to be speaking over them that their life does not have to revolve around some of these circumstances that speak potentially even death over them. We get to show them that their worth is measured by something even greater. In fact, their worth has been assigned to them by the creator of the universe who has created them on purpose and for purpose. When we do that, we get to instill in them the idea, a foundational truth that no matter what is happening around them, no matter their grades, no matter their Snapchat ranking, they have great value and worth. That is a lesson that they can take on for the rest of their lives, as well as impact all of their relationships in the way that people need to respect them. Now, we can do this through communication, which is my next takeaway. I love how Zach pointed out that communication is not always just validation, but he's also telling us that we need to be speaking truth over our kids. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but pointing out in a loving, grace-filled way the areas that our kids can grow in is actually loving them well, helping them grow and showing them that we care enough about them to not let them stay stuck in unhealthy patterns. In fact, there's a verse in Proverbs 27:5-6 that it says, "Better is an open rebuke than hidden love. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses." Anyone have relationships like that out there? Well, we want our kids to know that we're going to tell them truth. If they have something stuck in their teeth and they're out hanging out with their friends, they want us to speak, "Girl, get that broccoli out of your teeth. You look like a fool." The same thing that happens in their relationships, the same thing that happens in their patterns of dealing and coping. We start pointing that stuff out, then they can trust us enough to come in love, grace-filled, and the right appropriate time, and share with them ways that they can continue to grow in health. Now, in addition to speaking these truths over our kids to help them flourish, we need to also show them through our behaviors and our choices. And Zach talks a little bit about this as well. He talks about proving their significance by offering our presence together. We know life is busy. We have activities, but when we demonstrate to our kids that their life has great value because we are choosing to skip social events, putting down our book or our phones, and creating opportunities to be with one another, this sets the groundwork of understanding that their worth their value is so much more important than all of these other things. In fact, they are priceless, and we are showing that through our own choices and patterns of behavior. So it starts with us, parents. Make sure that you are making wise choices with your time. Friends, I hope that you've appreciated the conversation with Zach Clinton today. I know that I've enjoyed it and have some amazing takeaways. I want to continue to thank you for listening to the show. Of course, I am interested in your feedback. Maybe you have some ideas on guests you would want on the show. So I would love to hear from you. You can connect with me at paigeklingenpeel@gmail.com. Again, that's paigeklingenpeel@gmail.com. We have tons of exciting interviews coming up, so be sure to tune in again next time for another edition of Embracing Your Season.